Alright, what we're going to do now is allow users to search for any kind of 3D object they'd like rather than having the turkey hard-coded in. As you can see, I'm running the simulator over here on the right because we won't be needing the camera for a while. So in the home screen, I'm going to come down to the render function, and just temporarily we're going to add a view where we can do some experimenting with our UI. And once we're happy with the UI, we will integrate that into the entire app. So I'm just going to return a blank view. We'll give it a style with some padding on top. And save that and make sure we don't get any errors. Since we're going to have a search component, we're going to need a text input to allow users to type in the search that they'd like to do. So up in our imports, we will import text input from React Native. And back down here in our render method, let's add a text input. And let's also add a button that allows them to perform the search. So the title of the button will be search, and on press will be this.onSearchPress. And that, the text input will give a value equal to this.state.searchQuery. And on change text, we will say this.onSearchChangeText. And we'll need to implement these functions now. So let's add them right here. On search change text, we'll take a text as an input, and we'll just call this.setState, and we'll set search query equal to the text that we're given. And the onSearchPress function will look like this, but we'll implement this in just a second. We also want to go ahead and add search query to our state, so let's scroll up to the constructor here. And we don't have a state yet, so we'll say this.state equals, and we'll give it a property called search query, which starts off as a blank. While we're here, we can go ahead and delete this code as we don't need it anymore, and save and reload. Alright, the text input is a little bit difficult to see, so let's give it some style, and we'll add a little border around it. So let's add a new line here. Say style equals border width of 1. And we'll also add a placeholder that says search. Let's also set the height to 40 and reload. Okay, so we've got a search box here and a search button. It doesn't look great, but we'll make it look a little nicer later on. Now what we want to do is let's create a component for displaying our results. So if you remember down here, we had this image of the turkey object. Let's put that in here and take a look at it again. And it looks pretty nice, but I think we also want to add the author name and the display name of the object. And whenever the user searches for something, we'll show a table filled with these objects, which shows the image and the author's name. It's important to add the author's name because the objects are licensed under Creative Commons and you need to give attribution to the author. And the display name is good just so people might have a better idea of what the actual object is. Alright, so let's come over to our components folder and open up app components, and let's create a new file. We'll call this Google Poly asset.js, and we're going to create a new component. So let's import React from React. I'm going to import view, text, and image. We might need a few more later. But we know we need an image to display the thumbnail, and some text to display the author name and the display name, and a view to hold everything. So let me spell import correctly. And from React Native, and then we will export default class Google Poly asset, which extends a React.component. And it's going to need a render method, which we will just return a view for now. Fill that in later. But first, let's come into index.js, and let's import Google Poly asset from Google Poly asset, and then export Google Poly asset. All right, now we can access Google Poly asset and other files. Save that, and in our home screen, we will import Google Poly asset. So we'll come down here, import Google Poly asset from components/app components. Save that, reload. Now our Google Poly asset will take as a property the asset object. So let's make a default props object, and we'll say asset, which we will initialize to a blank object. And that's kind of a reminder that this needs to take an asset as a property. In our render method now we will return a view. And inside of this view we'll put all of the thumbnail and text stuff that we need for the asset. So let's flip back to the home screen and scroll down to our image right here and just copy and paste this so we don't need to retype it. And we'll put this in our view, and instead of source being the turkey object.thumbnail.url, it's now going to be the property asset that we pass in. So we'll say this.props.asset.thumbnail.url. And if we wanted, we could move these styles into a style sheet, so why don't we go ahead and do that now. We will import style sheet from React Native, and down here we'll say const styles equals style sheet.create, and we'll say thumbnail has a width of 150 and a height of 150. And we'll delete these styles out and instead say styles.thumbnail. Save that. Now why don't we try using the Google Poly asset instead of this image right here to make sure that it's working. So we'll add a Google Poly asset, and the asset will be turkey object. So if we did everything correctly, we should see the same thing on the screen once we delete this, but it'll now be inside of our Google Poly asset component rather than the image. And we have an error here. So let's double check. I think the error is that we didn't put this in brackets when we imported it. So you should import it correctly. And there you go. There's our thumbnail of our turkey. Now, one thing I wanted to do with this is I wanted to round off the corners just a little bit. I think it would look a little nicer, and the way you can do that is by setting a border radius. Let's give it a border radius of 10 and see how that looks. Okay, looks pretty good, and we can add some padding on the side later if we want to. Let's go ahead and add the display name and the author name down here. So we'll just add some text components. That one we'll put the display name, and here we'll put the author name. Let's give them each a style called styles.displayname and styles.authorname. Come down here and display name and author name. And I think what I would like is for the display name to be bold and the author name to be normal. So we'll put font weight is bold, and we don't need to put anything in author name because by default it will be normal. So let's go back to our turkey object.json reference and figure out what the property names are, and they're just called display name and author name. So we should be able to just add in this.props.asset.displayname, make sure to put it in brackets, and this.props.asset.authorname. And if we save it, we should now see our text below the image. Great. Let's also put a style on our view called styles.container. And let's also align our text using the text align property to be in the center. And maybe that's not how we do it. Maybe we need to put align items here, center. Okay, so everything's centered there. We can delete that if we want. All right, so now we've got a component we can use to display our search results. It'll look like this. And actually, we want to do one last thing. I think what I'd like to do is have users be able to click on the asset. So let's add a touchable opacity import from React Native. And let's surround the whole thing. Instead of a view, we'll surround it with a touchable opacity. And touchable opacities need an onPress property. So for onPress, we'll say this.props.onPress. And in our default props, we will initialize onPress to be a function that doesn't do anything. And this serves as both a reminder that you should pass in an onPress property, and it helps to prevent crashes in case somebody forgets the onPress property. When it tries to call this, it'll just call a function that doesn't do anything rather than crashing. So let's save it and try clicking on it. As you can see, the opacity changes, so it gives the user an indication that it was clicked on. So that should be all we need to display our search results.